Okay. Um, Good evening, class. We need to talk about the end of Vietnam. In class today, we talked about how America got into Vietnam, and tonight we need to talk about how the United States was able to kind of extricate itself from the Vietnam War. First, um, as we talked about in class, President Lyndon Johnson had really micromanaged Vietnam to the point where the military was finding it very, very difficult to make headway. And in 1968, President Johnson, made the decision not to run for reelection. He had finished up President Kennedy's term after the assassination. He had been elected in his own right. And he had the opportunity to actually serve another term, but he chose to bow out, and that led the way for President Nixon to become president. And Nixon gets elected president in part based on his quote secret plan to end American involvement in Vietnam. And Nixon basically had a three-part plan to get us out of Vietnam with what President Nixon called honor, um, to end our involvement in Vietnam while preserving America's honor. Okay, so this is what Nixon had in mind. Okay, first, we are going to turn the war over to the South Vietnamese. We're not going to fight the South Vietnamese war for them. We are not going to be South Vietnam's army. So Nixon referred to this as Vietnamization. Okay. So the way this would work is you would add a ARVN squad to a U.S. company, and they would learn how to operate like Americans, and then that company would be fully ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam's army, and you would simply gradually turn the war over to the South Vietnamese. And this process started shortly after he was elected in the 1970s. Um, and it was a fairly effective way to end the war. Okay. That meant you also had to have the ARVN well trained and well armed. And the United States started turning over to South Vietnam enormous amounts of weapons. I think by the time our involvement in Vietnam ends, the South Vietnamese Air Force is like the fourth largest air force on the planet. I think I could be wrong on that, but you're talking about an enormous buildup of military hardware in South Vietnam. South Vietnam very much had the hardware to defend themselves. All right, second strategy. Take North Vietnam and quote bomb them into the Stone Age. We talked about how President Johnson had all these no bomb zones, no go zones for the U.S. to go into. You couldn't bomb the capital. You couldn't bomb North Vietnamese air bases. You couldn't bomb Haiphong Harbor. And President Johnson started this process through what he called Operation Rolling Thunder, that the bombing would gradually escalate, and then eventually the Vietnamese would see that America was way too mighty for them to ever defeat. Nixon said, no, 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 none of that. He launches Operation Linebacker. And what Operation Linebacker was a complete and total dismantling of the North Vietnamese nation by the United States Air Force and United States Navy. Air bases were bombed, Haiphong Harbor was bombed, Hanoi was bombed. Every single thing that possibly had any military significance was now fair game. And Nixon took the gloves off and he bombed and bombed and bombed. He took big American B 52 bombers. These are big, massive, huge bombers, loaded them up with bombs and took them to downtown Hanoi and bombed the living daylights out of the Vietnamese. And the idea behind this was to weaken North Vietnam to the point where South Vietnam would have a fighting chance when America finally pulled out. Now, also, Nixon went after supply lines in Laos and Cambodia. He used U.S. military to invade Cambodia to destroy munition bases and ammunition bases. And really, the this really was fairly effective. It set the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, back years. And it really did give the ARVN breathing room. Now, his third strategy was to get the Soviet Union and the Chinese to play ball with us pulling out of Vietnam. And this, I think, is a masterstroke for President Nixon. And this is where I think President Nixon really understood how the world works. I don't think Nixon is given a lot of credit for some of this. People remember Nixon because of Watergate. They don't really recall the fact that he was one of the greatest foreign policy presidents we've ever had. Now, Nixon gets a message from the Chinese early in his administration that the Chinese, the communist Chinese, may be willing to switch sides in the Cold War. This is a big deal. And Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, also a very, very brilliant political foreign policy tactician, pondered the idea of taking China and flipping it onto our sides. Now, where this came from was that the Chinese and the Russians had a falling out. Even though they were both communist nations, they really were not getting along very well, and they had actually had a few skirmishes and gunfights across border areas. And so the Russians and the Chinese not getting along gave an opening for a possible Chinese flip in the Cold War. And over a period of time, a few months, an agreement was reached where Richard Nixon would actually fly to China and meet with the Chinese dictator Mao Zedong. And the one stipulation was America had to take their hands off Taiwan, which is an island off of China that claims to be the legitimate government of all of China and which we have been protecting. Taiwan was kind of sacrificed in order to flip China. Now, fortunately for Taiwan, it was never attacked or invaded. But by flipping China, you can now use the Chinese to pressure the North Vietnamese to kind of play nice with South Vietnam and the Americans. And so again, Nixon does all this, and Nixon is very, very savvy. Now, let's talk about what happens in the mid 1970s. America gradually pulls out of Vietnam, and we start peace talks in Paris. And the agreement with North Vietnam and South Vietnam and the United States really kind of screws over South Vietnam. First of all, the North Vietnamese, the NVA, are allowed to occupy areas that they are controlling at the time the peace treaty ends. Which means when we pull out, we leave North Vietnamese soldiers stationed or North Vietnamese soldiers occupying large amounts of South Vietnam. Then Congress cuts a lot of the aid and funding to the South Vietnamese military. And so, even though the South Vietnamese military has a lot of modern American weapons, they very quickly run out of spare parts and ammunition. And so, when the North Vietnamese finally press South Vietnam, they don't have the ability to use the weapons that have been provided by the United States. And this happens after Richard Nixon resigns after Watergate. And President Ford doesn't have the political ability to get Congress to approve weapons sales to South Vietnam. And so as a result, in 1975, South Vietnam falls. And I think it is really it was really unnecessary that South Vietnam should have fallen like it did. Um, but anyway, it did. So by 1975, South Vietnam had fallen, and a year later, South Vietnam and North Vietnam were finally reunited into one Vietnam. Now, on a side note, we talked about in class the concept of the domino theory that if you lose South Vietnam, you'll lose some of the other nations around it. And that does happen. Laos goes communist, and then Cambodia goes communist. And Cambodia's turn to communism is really horrible. A group called the Khmer Rouge, under a dictator called Pol Pot, is able to take control of Cambodia, and you have a reign of terror that takes place in Cambodia that is just unbelievable. The Cambodian communists do things like ban cities, and they take the urban population and spread them out the countryside, and they execute people who um, do simple things like complain that they're being worked too hard. It's an absolute reign of terror, and eventually the United Vietnam will actually go in and end the Khmer Rouge. So I think that's interesting. And also, Vietnam will end up fighting China for a while. The Chinese um, will be unhappy that Vietnam is not willing to take orders from them, and Vietnam and China will fight. And Vietnam does give China kind of a good drumming, I think. And I think it's interesting that the Chinese really don't do well fighting a united Vietnam. And ironically, m- Vietnam fights the Chinese and actually invades Cambodia to stop the Khmer Rouge using many captured American weapons. I think that's interesting. All right, so that's Vietnam in a nutshell. All right, that's the end of it. So that's continuation from class, and I will see y'all next week.